the story of the freeing of South America from the Spaniards, I became fascinated by one of them, Thomas Cochrane. As the section on him in Liberators was confined to his life in South America, I was unable to write about his Napoleonic War exploits and subsequent career in Greece in any detail. While his South American exploits are amazing enough, his achievements in the western Mediterranean, the Atlantic, and off the coast of France, as well as later in the eastern Mediterranean, are even more remarkable. He was a man who terrorized the eastern coast of Spain, inflicted fear upon the western shores of France, defeated the Spanish fleet off the Pacific coast of South America, tricked the Portuguese in northern Brazil into surrender, and then performed a major role in the Greek War of Independence. By any measure, these were amazing feats. Yet there had been no new biography of Cochrane in 20 years. Cochrane was much more than perhaps Britain's greatest sea captain. He was a radical MP who unashamedly espoused the cause of the oppressed of the time. He won one of the most spectacular battles of the Napoleonic Wars in defiance of his own commander-in-chief. He was immersed in an intricate stock exchange scandal straight out of the pages of Wilkie Collins, perhaps the greatest criminal cause célèbre of its day. And he was one of the most far-sighted and greatest innovators of naval strategy of his times, as well as a prodigious inventor. I owe a great debt to many people in preparing this book. They include the present Earl of Dundonald, Douglas Cochrane, David and Suzanne Cochrane Howell, all of whom have given me invaluable insights into their family's distinguished forebear. The two best academic biographies remain Donald Thomas's Cochrane and Ian Grimble's The Sea Wolf. Both were published in the 1970s. The former is finely written and researched, while Grimble first had access to the Cochrane family archives, and his book contains detail unavailable elsewhere, as well as being well written. Anyone who wants to pursue Cochrane's career in greater detail would be well advised to read these two books. Christopher Lloyd's Cochrane, although dating back to 1947, is a fine short summary of his life by a distinguished naval historian. On the judicial front, it remains fascinating how the polemics have continued down the generations. Cochrane's own autobiography, a large part of which is devoted to defending himself from the charges for which he was sent to jail, was answered by the grandson of Lord Ellenborough, the trial judge, which in turn was supported by Henry Cecil's The Guilt of Lord Cochrane, whose arguments were convincingly rebutted in a pamphlet by Douglas Cochrane, a direct descendant. The war of words goes on, and I have offered my own tentative verdict in these pages. I owe, as always, a great debt to Raleigh Trevelyan, whose writing and advice have inspired my own, to Gillen Aitken, whose encouragement and wisdom are without parallel, to my enthusiastic and painstaking editors, Nick Robinson and Roger Hudson, to Jan Chamier and Anna Williamson, to Christine, Richard and Emma, and all our friends in Myford, to my sister Antonella and her family for their warm and cheerful support, to my Uncle Peter, Lord Harvey of Tasborough, whose love of sailing helped to inspire this book, to my wonderful assistant, Jenny Thomas, who put up with so many unreasonable demands without a word of complaint, and her equally patient historian husband, Geoffrey, to my dear mother for all her help, which included first suggesting that I write this book, and to my darling Jane and Oliver, the best companions a writer ever had. Prologue. On the 20th of June, 1814, while the world went about its business on a cheerful summer's day in central London, a man was taken from the court-house of King's Bench, Westminster, and escorted to the nearby prison to begin a 12-month sentence. He had also been fined £1,000 and sentenced to the indignity of an hour in the pillory opposite the Royal Exchange, along with his co-defendants, the last man ever so sentenced. Although humbled, he was no ordinary criminal, but had the bearing of a major public figure, and was clearly from a privileged background, with a deeply distinctive appearance. In the words of a contemporary, writing a little later, "He was a tall young man, cordial and unaffected in his manner. He stooped a little, and had somewhat of a sailor's gait in walking. His face was rather oval, fair naturally, but now tanned and sun-freckled. His hair was sandy, his whiskers rather small and of a deeper colour, and the expression of his countenance was calm and self-possessed." On this occasion his countenance was lacerated with humiliation. He was shown to the Spartan 2 rooms, comfortable by the standards of common prisons, on the upper floor of the building, for which he had to pay rent and accommodation. He was told he would be given the privilege of being allowed to exercise within a half-mile radius from the prison, but in his bitterness he declined. His jailers left him to the turbulence of his thoughts. He wept bitterly. In his new surroundings his mind raced back to the freedom of wind and ocean over 20 years of one of the most extraordinary careers in British naval history. He had been prepared a little for confinement by the small cabins and close quarters of life at sea, but that was different because on deck he enjoyed the liberty of racing about on the world's oceans. This was no ordinary prisoner, and his crime no small misdemeanour. Thomas Cochrane was perhaps the greatest fighting captain that this seafaring huddle of islands off Europe's coast has ever produced. A hand-to-hand fighter, a figure of almost mythical dash, courage, intrepidity, and romanticism. He was now utterly disgraced. He had taken on not only the huge, visible Napoleonic foe, but had dared to oppose one far more elusive, Britain's often corrupt naval establishment. In addition to being Britain's greatest living sea hero, he had become an enemy of the state. His reputation has been indelibly tarnished ever since, to the point almost of being erased from the nation's historical consciousness, a non-person. He had been ruthlessly dispatched on a trumped-up charge in a trial staged after one of the most colourful criminal mysteries of the 19th century. Examining the details of the case, his innocence seems clear, as certain as, for example, that of Alfred Dreyfus in France more than a century later. Although the latter was a far less prominent personality, he suffered much more. What is much less obvious is the motive behind Cochrane's persecution. His supporters believed at the time that this was an act of exemplary revenge by the defenders of the status quo against one of their most formidable opponents, the removal by a governing cabal of a man who uncovered scandals and corruption that had caused untold suffering and death among thousands of ordinary sailors. But it could have been more complicated still, the cover-up of a scandal surrounding the most dubious clique ever to hold sway within the royal court. Either way, the persecution of Cochrane was to have an enduring effect, for in spite of a series of admirable scholarly biographies, he is now largely unknown to a wider public. But he is not altogether forgotten. In an astonishing tribute to his reputation and personality, this apparently flawed idol became the model for three of the greatest writers of British naval fiction after him. All three are far too eminent and skilful as authors to relate his exploits verbatim. Indeed, those exploits would be too incredible to relate as fiction. The first, Captain Frederick Marryat, who founded the genre of Napoleonic naval fiction, actually served under Cochrane and was unrepentant about his debt to him as the basis for Captain Savage. The second, C.S. Forester, in his Hornblower series, repeatedly evokes the incidents and venues of Cochrane's own career. And the third, the contemporary Patrick O'Brian, with his unique style and skilful development of character and plot, clearly owed a huge debt to Cochrane's extraordinary life. Indeed, the full irony of Cochrane's career, with its perverse changes of fortune, is well reflected by the personality of Captain Jack Aubrey, O'Brien's hero. A golden-haired, plain-speaking seaman, fond of prize money, accurate gunnery, and go-straight-at-'em tactics, who loses several fortunes, finds disfavour with the Admiralty, and, although pilloried as a result of a stock exchange scandal, ends up an admiral himself. The savage old men who sought to destroy Cochrane's reputation may instead have condemned him to an altogether more interesting fate, as the seaman who has given birth to one of the most exciting branches of English literature, the Napoleonic War sea adventure. Part 1. The Napoleonic Wars. The lieutenant of the watch looked with attention at the approaching figure. It was that of a skinny young man, only just leaving boyhood behind, something above middle height, with feet whose adolescent proportions to his size were accentuated by the thinness of his legs and his big hearth boots. The newcomer was dressed in a badly fitting uniform, which was soaked right through by the spray. A skinny neck stuck out of the high stock, and above the neck was a white, bony face. "How old are you?" 17, sir," stuttered Hornblower. 17? The disgust in the speaker's voice was only too evident. "You must start at 12 if you wish to become a seaman."
7